everything boiled down to lifestyle modification. None of the other things are making too much of a difference. The food and the exercise and the sleep and the sun.
First one is a very, very sophisticated and expensive device called a tape measure. What you do is you buy a tape measure and you put it around your belly and you put it around your waist. That's it. Step one isn't the exercise, it's not the sleep, it's not the diet. Step one is to embrace the idea that you're the one in charge and that you can make these changes that will have a huge impact on your brain's destiny.
There's not much spoken about the brain, which is like the control center of our system. Why is that?
It really gets back to the idea that the brain isn't part of the body, right? The brain lives in another country. Two things that are very important in terms of what makes a good brain go bad. First, age. And the second are the metabolic factors. Through the beauty of the term immunometabolism, now we understand that metabolism affects these microglial cells, these brain immune cells. We can absolutely shift these microglia right back to being M2 supportive brain defenders. That's the home run.
I'm Dr. Esra Çavuşoğlu, and I've been living a sober life for the past 20 years. My battle with addiction drove me to seek new methods, devices, and supplements to improve my physical and mental performance, enhance my quality of life, and ultimately live healthier for longer. From my experiences in addiction recovery, biohacking and longevity, to the latest global developments, from groundbreaking entrepreneurs to expert academics, the conversations I've had over the years are now featured weekly on Soberhead Podcast.
Welcome back to Soberhead Podcast. For decades, traditional medicine treated brain disease only after damage occurred. Few doctors challenged this approach like Dr. David Perlmutter. Through books like Grain Brain and Brain Maker, he showed how nutrition and gut health shaped our minds. Now, in his new book, Brain Defenders, he turns to the brain's immune system. He focuses on microglia. The tiny cells either protect our neurons or accelerate cognitive decline. Today, we go beyond standard sound bites. We examine 12 years of evolving science, human trial evidence, and practical steps to safeguard your brain. Here's my conversation with Dr. David Perlmutter.
Üniversiteyi sadece dersler, vizeler, finaller olarak düşünme. Asıl mesele okurken kendini keşfetmek, üretmek, projelerde yer almak ve mezun olmadan gerçek dünyayı tanımaya başlamak. Bir yandan psikolojiyle insanı daha iyi anlayabildiğin, beslenme ve sağlık bilimleriyle iyi yaşamanın ne demek olduğunu öğrendiğin, mühendislik ve yönetim bilişim sistemleriyle teknolojiyi, veriyi ve sistemi çözümleyebildiğin bir üniversite düşün. Yani sadece bilgi aldığın değil, düşündüğün, ürettiğin ve fikirlerini hayata geçirebildiğin bir yer. İstanbul Gedik Üniversitesi, öğrencilik hayatını gerçekten yaşarken geleceğini kurabileceğin bir deneyim sunuyor. Ayık Kafa'nın daimi destekçisi Gedik Eğitim Vakfı'nın sağladığı katkı ile size dünyanın önde gelen uzmanlarını konuk olarak getirmeye devam ediyoruz. Siz de Ayık Kafa'ya abone olarak destek verebilirsiniz.
Dr. David Perlmutter, welcome to Soberhead Podcast. I was really looking so forward for this moment because for so many reasons, but I have to start with my grandmother died of Alzheimer's disease. Of course, it's always a worry of my mom, which is, knock on wood, she's extremely healthy, but it's always in the back of her mind. Therefore, we're all kind of thinking, it never leaves our thinking. But I would like to introduce you to my audience because Turkish people may not be so much aware like how famous you are in America. For so many years, you practiced conventional neurology. Then nutrition became central to your work. In 2013, you wrote a book, Grain Brain, and after it came out, it sold over 1 million copies. Around that time, you got really pushed back from dietitians, neurologists, especially your concern with obviously the book title is The Grain Brain, so you were the gluten and the whole grain, but actually your argument was on sugar and glycation. It wasn't like, oh, all whole grain is bad. It was like very specific. Then from there, you wrote the Brain Maker, which was really very early on gut-brain axis. So you changed the field. Then from there, you moved to the drop acid, for about uric acid. And you have many books, but these are the very significant ones. And then you had your book with your son, which I interviewed, Brainwash, which was about the environmental toxins and the damage to the brain. And now Brain Defender, which is, I had the chance to receive it and I read a majority of part of it. And it's just a collection of all the information that you've been accumulating for years and years and years, and to help people how to defend their brain. I would love to say this too, and then I would let you to explain everything. But something that was really interesting to me in the book, you say something like, many, many years ago, you actually went to the Senate and you argued that this ultra-processed food is going to bring a tsunami of neurodegenerative diseases. Then at some other point around that time, you were in England and you were after a conference, you were invited by back then Prince Charles, now it's King Charles of England. He wanted to change actually the future of the country, which, like all the government, he was worried that, the food lobby will not allow it. So, well, welcome. This is a lot, but
well, thank you. Let me first start with. We'll go back to 2013 with Grain Brain, which is published in Turkish, I might add. The central tenet I think you really well described, and that is that we didn't have the term ultra processed foods back then, but this high level of consumption of processed, modified carbohydrates, my contention back then is that this practice was bad for the health, bad for inflammation, bad for risk of diabetes, blood sugar control, and importantly, bad for the brain. And you are right. There was a lot of pushback from the mainstream with reference to me saying that. That book was published in 32 languages around the world and wonderfully accepted around the world. But at the same time, there was pushback from all quarters. Now, of course, we have a term called ultra-processed foods. We have incredible validation that higher consumption of these ultra-processed foods is absolutely threatening to the health. It's related to all causes of death, all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, and absolutely risk of Alzheimer's disease. A study that came out last year in the Journal of Prevention of Alzheimer's looked at a large group of individuals and followed them for around 12.7 years and found that those who consumed just one serving, that's one handful of chips or a flavored yogurt as an average per day, experienced about a 13% increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. That's a lot. Yeah. And if you had 10 or more servings per day, the risk of developing this disease, Alzheimer's, for which we have no pharmaceutical approach, was increased by close to 300%. So that just came out. And, as you mentioned, Grain Brain was written way back in 2013. So it's taken a while. You mentioned Brain Maker, which was talking about the gut-brain connection. And again, what a pushback we got from that. Oh, and the gut has nothing to do with the brain. The microbes in the gut, unrelated to the brain. Now, of course, that we have the technology to evaluate the gut in terms of the bacteria and the metabolites that they produce, we recognize that they are fundamentally charting the destiny of the brain. And therefore, for the purposes of our time together today, really gives us great tools, great understanding so that we can make changes to really rewrite the destiny of our brains and really confront this absolute epidemic of brain degeneration that we're seeing globally.
While I was reading the book and doing some investigation, something got my attention that there's a lot of course awareness on ultra processed food is not good for the heart, it's not good for the gut, it's not good for obesity, diabetes, etc. But there's not much spoken about the brain, which is like the control center of our system. Why is that?
Let me jump in for a very quick second. If you can hear me right now, we know you're watching Soberhead. But are you subscribed? Could you check it for me? Very honestly, our subscriber count gives us real leverage when it comes to convincing the guests we invite to join the show. So, if you want to keep watching some of the best experts in their field right here, please subscribe to the channel.
I think that it really gets back to the idea that the brain isn't part of the body, right? Okay, we get the heart, we get the immune system, we get risk for cancer, we get diabetes, obesity, all that, but the brain The brain lives in another country, and that we're finally understanding that the body is integrated. That everything, there's no such thing as a heart smart diet that wouldn't be good for the rest of your body. A diet that keeps blood sugar in check, that lowers inflammation, that's high in fiber to nurture the gut bacteria, is going to be good for the heart. It's going to be good for the brain. So the brain, strangely enough, is part of the body. And it is as sensitive, if not more sensitive, to all of the processes that that negatively affect the body. Inflammation, free radical mediated stress, lack of appropriate nutrients, poor blood supply, higher levels of blood sugar, insulin resistance. All of these things affect your entire body. And guess what? That includes the brain.
That was fascinating, the book. I really liked it. I think when the hard copy is going to come, I'm going to be reading again because it's so important. We had a few weeks ago Jeffrey Blunt, and he was sharing how metabolism is very important. Then we had Gabrielle Lyon explaining how muscle is important for the metabolism. Then Ellen Langer saying like the body and the brain is connected. They're not separated. Like,
who knew?
Yeah, Dave Rabin saying the same thing. These are getting such great back-to-back episode for people to really understand. But in the book, you explain something about the immunometabolism, and that's the problem of all type of degenerative diseases. This is how you explain. Help us to understand, first of all, actually, help us to understand why high ultra-processed food is that bad for the brain. Then let's move to how is the connection of the immunometabolism.
Well, actually, both of those topics are intimately related. Mm-hmm. First, let's talk about immunometabolism. What a strange but actually very very beautiful term. Immuno, meaning obviously the immune system, metabolism, blood sugar control, blood pressure, body fat, etc. And I'm certain that when you spoke with Jeff Bland that he would have mentioned that because this is a topic he's been involved in for many years that we've spent a lot of time talking about. Strangely, as fate would have it, I'm having this discussion with you from a boat, and Jeff Bland actually built this boat upon which I am having this conversation with you. So it's a very small world. That said, let's unpack this a little bit. And in specific regards to the brain has its own dedicated immune system made up of cells that are called microglial cells. That's the brain's innate immune system. These cells make up about 10% of the brain's cells, and they are vitally important. They control whether the brain will function well and resist degeneration, or the brain will be degenerated and will basically stop working appropriately across all domains of neurodegenerative conditions, not just Alzheimer's, but Parkinson's and multiple sclerosis and PSP and MSA and all of these various seemingly unique diseases that we now understand are very much united by the fact that in these diseases, the immune system is destroying the synapses, destroying the connection from one neuron to the next, which leads to failure in different parts of the brain. That's the immune system. Let's get to the metabolism part. As it turns out, whether these immune cells are going to be supportive or destructive depends upon their metabolism, depends upon their ability to use glucose as a fuel, to use their mitochondria to make energy, and their metabolism. Here's the home run, most important point of our time today. The metabolism of these immune cells, which determines whether they're going to be supportive or destructive, whether they're going to be brain defenders or brain destroyers, their metabolism is dependent upon your body's metabolism. Think about that. All of the things that all of your guests have talked to you about and your audience about controlling your metabolism. Gabrielle Lyon's talking about exercise, building muscle to help with metabolism. Mm-hmm. All of these inroads to better metabolism targets the immune cells of the brain to be more supportive and pave the way for a better brain outcome. So that's the beauty of this term immunometabolism, and it's a relatively new term. So once again, in this new book, Brain Defenders, that's what we are unpacking. We're looking at the fact that, basically everything I've been writing about and studying and lecturing about for decades converges on the brain's immune cells. The ideas in Grain Brain about carbohydrates and gluten sensitivity, the ideas in Brain Maker, the role of the metabolism of the gut bacteria and what they create, influencing the brain's immune cells, the role in brainwash of stress and connection to other people, how that modulates our metabolism and therefore has an effect on the brain's immune system. This is central. It is the most important topic in neuroscience right now in 2025, 2026, and certainly moving forward, which is great news because we're finally getting away from this unsupported idea that, for example, in Alzheimer's, the cause is the accumulation of a protein called beta-amyloid. Absolutely false, and absolutely has cost billions and billions of dollars globally in terms of research and in terms of drug development, none of which has paid off at all.
I've been hearing about this from a lot of esteemed guests, but it still continues. They're coming up with it's even difficult to say the names of these drugs. They're still giving to people. They're still expecting something. They're still putting money in researchers still to the medication. And I don't see much of an awareness besides you and Dale Bredesen and a few more for the prevention. I mean, where do you think the conversation get disconnected?
Well, first, let me say, as far as not much awareness, the idea that this treating the beta amyloid is not going to work and is the wrong approach, as the idea that it's failed and false is gaining a lot of traction right now because of the fact that just a couple of months ago, a global, what's called Cochrane analysis was published, looking at 17 different studies encompassing 20,342 individuals, each of whom was followed for 18 months on drugs that are designed to lower beta amyloid to treat their Alzheimer's disease. And what the Cochrane analysis demonstrated was that across the board, the drugs absolutely failed. They didn't do really anything, as it turns out, in terms of modifying the rate of the mental decline of these people, and at the same time, expose them to dramatic risk of brain hemorrhage and brain swelling. And that's what this Cochrane independent analysis revealed. And yet, you're right, it's still the go-to approach, at least here in America, which is what Alzheimer's patients are offered. Yesterday, I was contacted by a family who the mother was actually put on this drug, and the very first treatment, she developed a brain hemorrhage. That happens, brain hemorrhage and brain swelling happens in about 20 to 25% of people treated with this drug. And it isn't surprising. Why are you using this drug to target beta amyloid? Number one, beta amyloid isn't the problem here. And number two, they are very, very dangerous. And number three, the drugs do not work. So you're right. I think that now that we're embracing immunometabolism, and I can assure you, Ezra, it's far more than Dale Bredesen, Jeff Bland, and David Perlmutter who are embracing this idea that this is central. This is the hot topic now in neuroscience. People are looking at ways to modify these immune cells. What are the signals that change them from being a good twin to being the bad twin? How can we interrupt that signal? And it turns out that it's all about metabolism. Interestingly, just yesterday, a study was published from in a journal called PLOS Biology, from Montreal that said, there are really two things that are very important in terms of what makes a good brain go bad. First, age. Age is a determinant of brain decline. We know that. And the second are the metabolic factors: elevated blood sugar, low levels of HDL, elevated blood pressure. I think they included nicotine exposure. And we will add to that lack of physical activity. These are powerful inroads that are modifiable. We can talk about biological age and what we can do to modify biological age, but the point is, by and large, we're getting older. Everybody's getting older. The clock is ticking. That's a risk factor for brain decline. But beyond that, we can modify these factors, modifiable metabolic factors, and really pave the way for better brain health. The mechanism is that metabolism affects these microglial cells, these brain immune cells. That is the absolute home run that we have been waiting for. This level of understanding has captivated neuroscientists around the world. So it's really becoming absolutely a central focus.
When you mentioned the M1 and M2, microglia 1 and 2, it seems like they switch in between.
That is the most empowering part of the book, Brain Defenders, and that is that we can absolutely shift these microglia right back to being M2 supportive brain defenders. That's the home run. That's what science is looking at. That's why there's a company called Vigil Neuroscience that was just acquired by Sanofi for $470 million that has created a small molecule that targets these the receptors on the microglia to keep them, push them back to being M2 supportive microglial cells. This is an incredibly important opportunity. And when you realize that even metabolic improvement, which we can do, anybody can do, can lead to an improvement of these microglial cells and improvement in cognitive function. Who knew? A couple of studies come to mind. One is called the Pointer Study. That was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The Pointer Study involved 20,111 individuals, participants, and they were followed for a period of time. And what the intervention was in the Pointer Study was simply lifestyle changes. They were encouraged to exercise. They were encouraged to eat better food. They did brain training games. They did something called Brain HQ. And they had two groups. This is a 2-year study. They had two groups. In the first group, they had 38 times that they met with somebody in the study to encourage them to see how they were doing. And they got the program. The other group got the program, but only met with the people in the study 3 times a year. So a total of only 6 times as opposed to 38 times. What did they find? This was a group of people, average age around 69.5 years. And these are people with metabolic issues, and some of whom carried APOE4, an Alzheimer's risk marker. What did they find? What were their findings? We expect in a 2-year period in these people, age 69.5 as an average, with metabolic issues, normally they would decline in their mental function. What was observed, however, was there was a dramatic improvement in cognitive function right in parallel with their metabolic improvement, immunometabolism, in the group that was meeting with the counselors very frequently. But here's the point of the study that I think is really pretty dramatic and got sort of forgotten. The other group that didn't have the meeting with the counselors, but still got the information, was told what to do, but didn't get the hand holding, they had almost the same improvement. Think about that. That for me, it means giving information is a really good thing to do, because people, if they understand that this is a way to regain brain function, shift the microglial cells back to being supportive, can improve cognitive function with lifestyle. Wow. And getting back to a point that I think you touched upon earlier when you mentioned prevention, that's the ultimate goal here. The ultimate goal is to target individuals who are cognitively intact and give them this information now such that they don't go down the wrong road. When you think about it, as far as if there were Alzheimer's treatment, how it's done is generally you end up going to the doctor's office once you're failing, once you're starting to be forgetful and not able to carry out purposeful acts, forgetting people's names, going into a room, not remembering why. That's when you seek help. But what we've just mentioned is that if this is a metabolic issue, then we should begin looking at, well, when do these metabolic issues begin to manifest? They begin to manifest in our 30s and our 40s. That's when the seeds of Alzheimer's are planted. Not when we're suddenly forgetting our grandchildren's names, but a lot earlier, 10, 20, 30 years earlier. that's when we've got to start implementing exactly what I talk about in this new book, exactly what I talked about in Grain Brain so many years ago. And that is reining in our metabolism. We didn't know back in the Grain Brain days this idea of immunometabolism. We knew that having a good metabolism, keeping your blood sugar down was good for the brain, but we didn't know why. Now we know why.
Yesterday, I did another podcast with a professor from Israel, actually. They're trying to influence people to say, like, yeah, for longevity, let's say it's never too late, but it's never too early. Children or babies in the womb of the mother, if the mother has hypertension, if the mother has diabetes, after years being born, these kids has been watched and observed that they developed all these metabolic issues, actually. So it starts really, really much earlier, it seems like.
Ezra, you're right. I'm often asked that question. Well, when should we begin the program? And the default answer for me is, because it's very common, in our 30s and 40s. But in utero, you're right. These things are important, and even method of delivery. I wrote about that in Brain Maker. That the risk of a variety of autoimmune and inflammatory conditions is dramatically increased in children born by a cesarean section versus those who are born through vaginal delivery, based upon the anointment of the child with the bacteria, either in the birth canal or what happened to be in the case of the cesarean section on the surgeon's gloves at the time of the surgery. So you're exactly right. And it really explains, I think, a lot of the fact of risk of Alzheimer's based upon did mother or father have Alzheimer's. And interestingly, the risk of Alzheimer's is much greater if mother had it versus if father had it. So your point is absolutely well taken. We can't not pay it. We must pay attention. I didn't want to use a double negative. We must pay attention to these metabolic issues throughout the life continuum, that's for sure.
It seems like, she was explaining there are studies that, had 3 group of children that they watched from the age of, like, say, 2 till 30. And these kids who were, like, chubby and obese, they continued like that. And they ended up really, really metabolically super unhealthy versus these skinny kids. And it was like a message to parents, actually, like, don't overfeed your children.
I hear you absolutely loud and clear. But the other message is that, okay, let's say you were chubby as a kid, as a teenager, and maybe your blood sugar was elevated. You noticed it in your 30s. And now, nowadays, these kids are checking their blood sugars and they're wearing the glucose monitors and all the things, right? This is, as we talked about earlier, it's reversible. We can regain our metabolic health. We could be on a more ketogenic diet, cut the carbs, exercise more, get better sleep, spend time in nature, have better relationships. These things all affect metabolism. They all affect the brain's destiny. So, what are we talking about? We're talking about our lifestyle choices dictate our brain's destiny. There are a lot of people my age who are having cognitive issues now, really because, respectfully, they made the wrong choices as related to their metabolism in their 30s and 40s and 50s. So this is correct. It's a very important message for those generations to embrace, because you're going to be my age sooner than you think.
Yeah.
And you want to hope that your brain will be along for the ride. But there's a movie director named James Cameron, did Titanic, did some very famous films. And he famously said that hope is not a strategy.
Yeah.
It's action. It's all about action, all about making the right decisions. My mission in life is to give people the information so that they are more aligned with what the science is teaching us about what those decisions should be in terms of what we do today. What are our choices today that will influence the brain as it plays out over the next several decades?
Dr. Perlmutter, you said that, kind of explain it. One system causing multiple different neurodegenerative diseases. How is it picking it's going to be a Parkinson or an Alzheimer or an MS? Like, please help me to understand.
I love this question. I have thought about this question for so many years, right?
Let me jump in for a very quick second. If you can hear me right now, we know you're watching Soberhead. But are you subscribed? Could you check it for me? Very honestly. Our subscriber count gives us real leverage when it comes to convincing the guests we invite to join the show. So, if you want to keep watching some of the best experts in their field right here, please subscribe to the channel.
Why? Why does one part of the brain degenerate in Alzheimer's and another part is involved, the substantia nigra is involved in Parkinson's? How does it happen? And I had the opportunity to interview a researcher, Dr. Sarah Marzi at the Marzi Neuroscience Institute at King's College in England. She was on my podcast. And so she's done a lot of work to explore this. And she gave me the answer. And it turns out that in the various neurons, in the different parts of the brain, the genetics are, of course, the DNA is exactly the same in every cell in your entire body. We understand that. What is different? The epigenetics, the markers on the DNA that change the gene expression and are involved with, for example, susceptibility to degeneration, and are involved with things like the production of free radicals from the mitochondria and all of these things that will then attract these microglial cells to damage those areas. The idea that microglial cells, for example, are destroying the cells that make dopamine in the Parkinson's brain, we saw that in 1992. We've known about that for a long time, that when people who were exposed to a mitochondrial toxin in the early 1980s and developed Parkinson's basically overnight, years later when they passed and they were able to evaluate their brains, the microglia were still involved in damaging those tissues that make the dopamine. This was revolutionary, but the science had not come along yet to fill in the blanks that this is a mechanism not just in Parkinson's, but across the spectrum of neurodegenerative conditions. It is now the central theme in Alzheimer's disease that the immune system is what is involved, that these microglial cells are destroying the synapses, the connection of one brain cell to the next, and that leads to the clinical manifestations of Alzheimer's, the forgetfulness, the loss of executive function, etc., the various metrics that characterize that disease process. Front and center is the loss of connection of one neuron to the next that leads to the loss of connection of that individual to understanding who he or she is, and then their loss of connection to the world around them. So in a very real sense, loss of connection is what characterizes that disease and really all of the neurodegenerative conditions. But the question that you asked, why is it in multisystem atrophy? Why is the autonomic system involved? Why in Parkinson's the motor system? It's fascinating, but at the end of the day, it is all about degeneration of the brain caused by the microglial cells. To the extent that, wow, the research going on is just mind-blowing what researchers are doing. There is now a technique to transplant healthy microglial cells into the brain of humans, already being done for a particular neurodegenerative condition that is uniformly fatal. It's called ALSP. It's not Lou Gehrig's. It's a different, ALSP stands for something else. It's a degeneration of the white matter of the brain brought on by a problem with the microglial cells. So they sterilize the brain as it relates to the microglia, then they transplant microglial cells into the brain, and now these people are surviving. So it's a very, very exciting time in research, in pharmaceutical and technology research, totally happy with that, but also in our understanding about metabolism affecting the microglial cells. And we can control that right now.
I do work with Dr. Elizabeth Uric, and one day I happened to ask her, like, what's the most important organ you think for the body? And she goes like, it's not the organ, it's immune system. Back then, it didn't make sense to me, but doing all these podcasts and understanding how important immune system is in the system, it's just like mind-blowing. I didn't hear about the microglia transplantation. I heard about the mitochondrial. I thought that it was just the mitochondrial for the system, full system. So it says two separate interventions.
Well, actually, there is research being done to transplant mitochondria. And I'm glad you opened up that topic because it's something we certainly need to cover. The mitochondria, as we know, are the metabolic energy-producing parts of the cell. A neuron, one brain cell, might have 2,000 mitochondria in it. And guess what? The microglia have mitochondria as well. And immunometabolism. When the metabolism of the mitochondria changes, it affects the microglia. The shift from being supportive immune cells in the brain to being damaging, destructive microglial cells is characterized by a loss of mitochondrial function. So you've talked a lot about mitochondria on your programs. I mean, you know, if you had Gabby Lyons on your program, you were talking about mitochondria, I can assure you. And Dr. Bland as well, and Dr. Bredesen, and my son, Austin Perlmutter. Everything is about the mitochondria because that's the energetics of the cell, it's the energetics of the entire body, and importantly, it is the energetics, the metabolism, that involves this term immunometabolism. When the mitochondria fail, then the immune system shifts to being non-supportive and destructive. The fundamental shift of M2 supportive brain defenders to being M1 destructive microglial cells is the shift of their mitochondrial function. So everything we do that is designed to shift them back to being supportive, back to your earlier point, is really targeting metabolism, and it's targeting the mitochondria. What can we do to improve mitochondrial function? I would instruct your viewers to go back and watch the Gabby Lyons interview that you did, because everything she's talking about is talking about restoring mitochondrial function, in this case by exercise, by improving how our muscles work. There are many other ways: ketogenic diet, intermittent fasting, fasting in general. There are a variety of things. Coenzyme Q10. We know there are a variety of supplements, for example, urolithin A, that target the mitochondria, that play a central role in the program that we have developed to help restore microglial brain immune function back to being supportive.
You're also very big on dropping the uric acid levels. And there's some contradiction out there. The reason I know that, it's not personally they name you, but you know, I had tests.
That's okay.
No. Through me, I didn't really understand what uric acid does, but you know, I did screenings and also blood work with Dr. Goodenow. There, he was trying to elevate my uric acid. Just you say like uric acid is super important. It has to be very, very low. For me, I would love to understand what it does and why do you prefer it so low?
Well, you said very, very low. And actually, that's not the goal.
Okay.
The goal is to normalize uric acid because, interestingly, if you look at epidemiologic studies that look at uric acid levels in comparison to a diagnosis, for example, like Alzheimer's, you recognize at very, very low levels, to use your terminology, there's actually an increased risk.
Oh, okay.
So there was a time, because extracellularly, uric acid acts as an antioxidant. So there is some discussion, you're correct, that we need some uric acid on board to act as an extracellular antioxidant. Intracellularly, within the cell, uric acid is a pro-oxidant. It's actually damaging to mitochondrial function. So it's a bit of a nuance, and I would agree with that person that you had that discussion with, that there's a consideration in a person with an extremely low uric acid that it shouldn't be that low. But what we do know is that at higher levels, above, we usually say 5.5, that uric acid does some things well aside from increasing our risk for gout. Uric acid is a very powerful regulator of metabolism. Higher levels of uric acid induce issues with increasing blood sugar and also are threatening to the mitochondrial function. And it really goes back to, why do humans have elevated uric acid in the first place in comparison to other mammals? And it turns out that when you look at history, about 8 million years ago, our primate ancestor, particularly one called Proconsul, developed a genetic change that took away the enzyme that other primates have that breaks down uric acid. Why did that happen? It happened during a time of food scarcity. And this sounds like I'm way out there, but let me work through this.
Sure.
So the primate that lost the uricase enzyme, so it can't break down uric acid anymore, so uric acid accumulated, had a survival advantage. Why? Because that primate developed higher levels of uric acid. When that animal consumed carbohydrate by eating fruit, for example, ripened fruits in the summer and the early fall, that fructose, fruit sugar in the carbohydrate, which is metabolized to uric acid, created a higher level of uric acid. What did that do? It raised blood sugar to power the brain, and it shifted the body to storing and not burning fat. That is a powerful survival mechanism during times of food scarcity. We have the same genetics. We humans have lost the enzyme that breaks down uric acid, so we are at risk for elevation of uric acid because in humans, it was a survival mechanism. Having a higher uric acid level was a survival mechanism, allowed us to survive when we couldn't find food because we would store our fat, we would burn it less readily. And the problem with that setup is that nowadays most of us are not having food scarcity, and we're having a lot more fructose in our diets. A lot more of this particular sugar comes from fruit, high fructose corn syrup, another source. 60%, 70% of foods, packaged foods here in America have added sugar. And what this sugar does is it stimulates, when it's metabolized, the production of uric acid. Uric acid is a signal in your body that winter is coming. Store fat. That's powerful. So this was a survival mechanism during times when we didn't have food. Now we are targeting that pathway with fructose every single day, and we wonder why rates of obesity globally are so very high. And again, it's because of the consumption of foods that are sweetened, as well as ultra-processed foods that do what? Immediately raise blood sugar, and as a consequence, will ultimately raise uric acid. So this powerfully explains why we're seeing an incredible increase of obesity and diabetes globally. And this runs in parallel with Alzheimer's disease as well. Why? Because those are metabolic issues. Through the beauty of the term immunometabolism, now we understand what happens to the microglial cells, the brain's immune cells, when our metabolism is threatened by our consumption of these foods. So do you see how it's tying everything together that we've been looking at for decades? That's why I find it so exciting.
What are the markers that they should check and see, like, oh, I have a problem with my immunometabolism? I'm sure there are some blood markers that you're looking at to decide. It's not just being sick or not, I guess.
It's a very good question. And clearly in Brain Defenders, in the new book, I talk about some pretty sophisticated tests that are available. But let me talk to you about what I think are the most important and the most available. The first one is a very, very sophisticated and expensive device called a tape measure. What you do is you buy a tape measure and you put it around your belly and you put it around your waist. That's it. Then you calculate those two numbers. You put waist number measurement divided by the hip measurement. That's all you want to do. And that's called the waist to hip ratio. In men, if that's greater than 0.8, in women, if it's greater than 0.9, people can watch the podcast again to get those numbers. It means that you are at risk for immunometabolism issue. That means that you are risking having your microglia cells activated and destroying your brain. That's pretty simple, and it's pretty darn powerful and gives you a lot of insight, right? Other non-sophisticated tests that can tell you, are you activating your microglia to be destroying your brain? Look at your fasting blood sugar, fasting insulin level, a very powerful and rarely used laboratory study. Next time you have your blood tests checked, done your normal annual blood work, or every 6 months, whatever it is the frequency, and they're going to check a fasting blood sugar, say, by the way, please check my fasting insulin level. Oftentimes the response is, well, you don't need to know that. You don't have diabetes. The response should be, you're right, and I don't want to get diabetes, please check my fasting insulin level. The hemoglobin A1C, very important. Beyond that, we'd like to know your vitamin B12 level, your homocysteine level, HOMOCYSTEINE. Now we're getting a little bit more out there, a little bit more brain-centric and heart-centric. Both of those are important for, especially homocysteine, cardiovascular health. And in the book, we talk about some other tests like p-tau217, which may not be available globally, certainly available
It is
here.
available here.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And not every country has that, but in America now, you don't even need a doctor's prescription. You can get your p-tau217 checked. Now, that is a powerful, very dedicated test as it relates to the brain and the brain's destiny, as it relates specifically to Alzheimer's disease. As a matter of fact, just last week, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, a study appeared where they followed several thousand individuals aged 35 to 100 over a period of, I think it was 5 years. They measured initially this blood test I'm talking about called p-tau217, which has already been used as a marker of do you have Alzheimer's or not. This new study that just appeared in JAMA showed that it is predictive, that having an elevated p-tau217, in this study, a high level, which is more than 2.5 standard deviations above the average, was a powerful predictor that you were going to have brain function decline over the 5-year period. So, wow, that is really very important. And from my perspective, it's empowering because p-tau217 responds to exercise and responds to reining in our metabolism. Why? Because p-tau217 is a marker of the destruction of the synapses. That's where it's liberated into the bloodstream. What destroys the synapses? Activated microglial immune cells in the brain, activated because our metabolism has gone off track. So what I'm feeling this right now in this conversation, that everything is coming together. And it's, it's been decades for me to get to this point where suddenly everything we've looked at converges on this immunometabolism understanding. So it's an exciting time indeed.
It is very exciting. Before we started our podcast, my producer is here, and he says, like, this is going to be our maybe 130th episode that we're recording. At the beginning, there were more like the gene testings and biohackings and, longevity tools and plasmapheresis and everything. But finally, everything boiled down to lifestyle modification. None of the other things are making too much of a difference. Yes, these are like fancy, nice tools, but like the food and the exercise and the sleep and the sun.
It's funny. Last week, an interesting study was published by Avid Johnson and David Sinclair. David Sinclair is at Harvard. And what they did was really quite interesting. They looked at various biological clocks, which people are using now to determine your biological aging, developed by Dr. Stephen Horvath, and now other clocks developed by other people. And what they tried to determine is, okay, there's all these things out there that you just mentioned. There's metformin and rapamycin and nicotinamide riboside, all these interesting approaches people are popularizing, influencers are popularizing that can have an impact on longevity and our biological age. Well, they looked at the research that evaluated these things to determine what is their effect on biological age. And interestingly, what they found was that the best levers to pull were what you just mentioned. Number one on the list to reduce biological age was exercise. Think about it. Just exercise. It wasn't rapamycin. It wasn't nicotinamide riboside. And what they found interesting was plasmapheresis that you just mentioned was actually associated with a slight increase in biological aging in their analysis of various studies. So, you're right. It's back to the basics. And that I think democratizes our discussion
Exactly.
in terms of what people can do. You don't have to go to a lab and have these very expensive high-tech interventions. Get a pair of running shoes, get out in nature and walk, get to bed on time, don't eat too late, have a time-restricted eating, don't eat, have an 8-hour eating window, has been shown to be effective in this regard. Take whatever supplements are necessary for you based on blood testing, based on the things that we think are important, especially vitamin D. What they did find in this study by Dr. Sinclair was that those who took a multivitamin actually had a activation of the anti-aging epigenetic markers, or the reduced biological aging epigenetic markers. So it isn't difficult. That's what I'm messaging here. But step one isn't the exercise, it's not the sleep, it's not the diet. Step one is to embrace the idea that you're the one in charge and that you can make these changes that will have a huge impact on your brain's destiny. That's the most important domino that has to fall. After that happens, then you do all the things. But you've got to get this message front and center.
Let me jump in for a very quick second. If you can hear me right now, we know you're watching Soberhead. But are you subscribed? Could you check it for me? Very honestly, our subscriber count gives us real leverage when it comes to convincing the guests we invite to join the show. So, if you want to keep watching some of the best experts in their field right here, please subscribe to the channel.
That's super important. Even though you gave like some hopeful study outcomes, like, when you do all these, lifestyle modifications, things would reverse a little bit, probably not like a whole of a lot. Like you don't go back to normal, but, people should not wait until they come to that point, because it's very painful for the families and for the people. I'm sure you're seeing it. I see an interesting resistance on people who are having these diseases. I know many people, young people with MS. I know my age people, like, with Parkinson. I know people with Alzheimer's disease, not yet maybe there, but the cognition started being fuzzy. I don't see them doing much. At least the people around me. There's a resistance of accepting the fact, it seems like.
You bring up an extremely important point that by and large people offload these decisions to their caretakers and their healthcare providers. That just tell me what to do and give me the prescription. It isn't working in Alzheimer's. And the reality is, you've had multiple discussions with people about these lifestyle interventions across the spectrum of total body issues, whether it's cardiovascular health or diabetes, whatever it may be. And I think that there's a tendency to want to just let the doctor fix it for me. Here, just give me the prescription. As it relates to Alzheimer's, there is no drug that is effective to treat the underlying disease. As it relates to Parkinson's, there is absolutely no pharmaceutical fix for that disease. In Parkinson's, we have wonderful drugs to treat the tremor, reduce the tremor, to reduce the rigidity, to improve the gait, improve the activities of daily living, no question. But the underlying disease, the fire, as opposed to the smoke, the fire keeps burning. And having said that, I will bring up one interesting recent report came out of the New England Journal of Medicine back in 2024, and it was a study of 151 Parkinson's patients divided in half. One group got a placebo for a 1-year period of time, and one group got a GLP-1 drug, an Ozempic-like. It was not Ozempic, but it was a different molecule that was smaller, so it made its way into the brain. They followed these people, and lo and behold, the group that got the placebo, as expected, continued to deteriorate as Parkinson's patients do. The group that got the GLP-1 drug, which targets mitochondrial function, therefore targets the microglia in the brain, which are central to Parkinson's, they did not decline any further. The disease was arrested. It was stopped dead in its tracks. That was a huge finding. Now, to be fair, the people taking the drug had a significant pushback in terms of side effects that were gastrointestinal, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, you name it. But I'm very encouraged because this means more work needs to be done. But look what happens when we target microglia, when we target metabolism. Look what happens in the brain to the microglial cells. I am very encouraged. Am I opposed to a drug approach for these issues? Not in the least. And I was very clear about that in the new book. If there's a GLP-1 agonist that can be proven effective like this drug was, but has a better side effect profile, would I be in favor of using that in Parkinson's patients or Alzheimer's, whatever, if it's proven effective? 100%. Count me in. I'm not opposed to the utilization of any pharmaceutical or really any other intervention if it's going to help people.
Yeah.
And call it like it is. Alzheimer's is a almost uniformly fatal condition. It is.
Mhm.
So that's when we pull out the stops and we embrace the idea of drug interventions. I'm happy to make the box bigger.
Since you're in front of me, I would love to ask you with other interventions, like I did a podcast with Sheldon Jordan. He was explaining the exosomes going to the brain with ultrasound and things were getting better, or some gene therapies. Do you see any hope on these interventions?
Absolutely.
Mm.
And what he has described and what others are working on are these delivery systems whereby these novel molecules can make their way to the brain and target the brain's immune cells. And as it relates to the microglial cells, there's already in development ways of targeting their particular receptors that will keep them in their M2 supported configuration. One receptor that's being targeted is called the TREM2 receptor. And there are now we are even seeing the development of gene therapies,
Mhm.
one and done, delivered by an adenovirus that can make their way to the brain and can set up shop and develop these genes, then allow the production of specific chemicals to target the microglial cells to keep them in their supportive role. So I'm extremely
Mhm.
encouraged about these very novel delivery systems for the very chemicals that can target the microglial cells and revert them back to being brain defenders and keep them as brain defenders. That's the future, and it's extremely exciting. For now, we already have the tools from improving our metabolism. Well, you
Mhm.
can do that tomorrow morning when you wake
Mhm.
up and start on this program. But what will the future hold? I think 5 to 10 years from now. Again, we've already talked about the fact that even microglia themselves are being
Yeah.
transplanted, mitochondria are being transplanted. But the idea of modifying mitochondrial function in the brain already being explored, the idea of modifying these microglia by technology and pharmacology is already demonstrated and being utilized. Dr. Li Wei Tsai at Massachusetts Institute of Technology has been studying the use of a light that flashes 40 times per second, 40 hertz light, to reprogram microglia back to being supportive in
Oh.
humans and in humans with Alzheimer's, and getting positive results. Non-invasive, no downside, except for people who have what is called photoconvulsive epilepsy, so they don't get to have the treatment. But flashing a light and playing a sound through headphones for 30 minutes a day, getting the most outstanding results in Alzheimer's beyond any pharmaceutical. So the future is bright. I'm hugely encouraged.
I have a note about that, but is it the same system? Do you know the V-Light from Canada?
No, there's another system that I actually use myself called Optoceutics,
Oh.
made in California. I have that device on my desk, and it's on when I'm working at my desk. So I don't know the V-Light particularly what that's involved, but what we're looking for is 40 hertz.
Yeah, it's a 40 hertz
That
gamma waves that, they have
Yeah, there
studies
are a
also
bunch of them out
about
there. And you can
dementia.
buy a 40
Mhm.
hertz light bulb now
Oh.
and just put it in your lamp. So this is how simple is this? I hate to call it a hack. I don't know why I reject that term, but anyway. How simple is it?
Yeah.
Just 40 hertz light reestablishes in the brain a background rhythm called gamma oscillation,
Mhm.
which helps to reduce inflammation and helps to create an internal environment that's conducive to healing, conducive to shifting our microglia back to being brain
Mm.
defenders. So, this is front and center. It's what people are doing around the world. So, again, The future is bright, and that there's a bit of a play on words there with the light, bright. The future looks very encouraging.
Dr. Perlmutter, this was such a amazing for me. It's like one of the highlights of my podcast career. Thank you so much for your time. You're amazing. Obviously, you're changing the world with your messages, and thank you so much for making time for this podcast.
I am so grateful for the time we had together and to be given the opportunity to share this information. I really think it's important. Thank you so much.